Welcome to the Clutch Kitten Gaming Podcast, where I play an indie game for 5 hours and let you know whether or not it's worth your time and money. Hello and welcome everyone, this is James, also known as Clutch Kitten, and I am so excited that you're here for episode 32 of the show. I am finally well, so I shouldn't sound like I'm plugging my nose for the whole episode, and I'm recording this before heading out on a short vacation, so I'm in an amazing mood. Something else that puts me in an amazing mood is when you tell your friends about the show. I know that a lot of you do this already, especially those of you who are friends on Instagram, but if you haven't before, that is currently the best way to support the podcast. Even if you don't have a crew of other gaming friends that you're always hanging out with, maybe consider mentioning the podcast next time you hear a coworker mentioning Apex Legends in the break room. I actually had that exact situation come up the other day from a manager I didn't expect to hear it from, so maybe the same will happen to you. On top of mentioning the show to your friends, I love it when I hear directly from each one of you. You can shoot me an email at klutchkittengaming@gmail.com or DM me on Instagram at klutchkittengaming to say hi, ask me a question, send me a dare, or let me know your thoughts on the show. Although, let me warn you that if you ask me a question on Instagram and the platform decides to die for most of the day, your question might be delayed until the next show. Game Brews, brother, I am looking at you. I saw that you messaged me, but when I jumped on the app to reply, I realized that Instagram was no more and the entire world started freaking out. Usually this wouldn't have actually been an issue since I normally record on Fridays, but I'm out for an early weekend to go enjoy the snow and drink some beer, so it's currently Wednesday when I'm recording. Anywho, let's take a moment to jump into this week's news. Besides these crazy Instagram and Facebook outages, one of the most interesting pieces of news I found was that Microsoft will now let you stream PC games to your Xbox One via their newly updated wireless display app. As of yet, the app doesn't support keyboard and mouse, but with Microsoft already adding keyboard and mouse support for a few games last year for Xbox One, it really wouldn't be a surprise for that to be added for this app in particular, at least pretty soon. Although streaming PC games to a TV really isn't anything revolutionary or new, it's really awesome seeing Microsoft continue to take steps to connect the platforms they're on. As someone who doesn't even own an Xbox One, hearing news like this is incredibly exciting to me. I'm really looking forward to what next-gen gaming will look like in the coming years, and despite being skeptical about the whole game streaming side of things, I'm excited to see how all of this cross-platform connectivity will look. Let's transition now to this week's game. Today we're going to be talking about Mana Spark, which is an action RPG roguelike game that was released on September 27th of 2018 for PC and December 22nd of 2018 for Switch. This was developed by Behemoth, which is a game company based in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and made up of Douglas Oliveira and Ed Freitas, whose names I probably both mispronounced, but bear with me. According to their press kit, Douglas and Ed worked together at 3 separate companies, 2 of which were game companies, before getting fired in the end and deciding to pursue their dream of creating what they wanted to make. That drive is what created their first game, Mana Spark. Currently, the game costs $9.99 on both Steam and Switch, and my guess is that, depending on your skill level, it could take you anywhere from 3 to 10 hours to beat. That's obviously a huge gap, but as we'll get into in a bit, this is a very skill-driven game. Although progression is important and helpful, you really could beat the entire game in your first run if you're really that good. For controls, you can use either mouse and keyboard or gamepad, although I will say that using the Switch Joy-Cons, especially at first, was incredibly frustrating. I'll talk a bit more about it later on, but the way aiming and shooting was designed just felt off and led to some very frustrating moments. I didn't personally play with the mouse and keyboard, but I'm sure that it feels much better. Mana is what fuels this world. Great societies have been built on strong mana energy, which has given them the ability to use powerful magic to beat down their enemies and protect against their foes. Unfortunately for us humans, we haven't been gifted with great mana energy, and as a result, we've been the ones who have been beaten down and abused. There are only a few of us left, yet despite our countless disadvantages, we're going to do all that we can to fight back. Mana Spark is set in a fantasy universe filled with magic, swords, shields, and bows. You start out as a character called the Hunter who has only one friend at the start. Luckily that friend has connections because the crux of the story is to rebuild your village and defeat your enemies. If you haven't picked up on it already, the narrative is pretty generic in this title. There's a story screen that plays every time you boot up the game, but outside of that short introduction to the world, the story beats are pretty much non-existent. Sure, you do gain a better understanding of the world you're in as you fight through waves of enemies and meet new people that come to your town, but none of those battles or conversations really flesh out details. Why is my character so ready to fight back? Were my parents killed in the Great Mana Wars? Or did I witness the massacre of a city while I remained out of sight? Who are the enemies I'm fighting against, and why do they hate humans so much? These are questions that aren't even brought up in Mana Spark, and as a result, they never really get answered. This may actually be one of the shortest discussions we have over narrative because there really is so little of it in this game. Because that's the case, let's move on now to discuss the gameplay. Luckily, there is quite a bit more to talk about in terms of gameplay. First off, let's set up the structure of the game. This is a top-down, pixel art style roguelike. If you're at all familiar with the genre, it won't be a surprise to you that there's permadeath, in-run progression that doesn't carry over to your next run, out-of-run progression that you can permanently unlock, and procedural generation of levels. When you start a run, you battle your way through a couple of areas and then face a boss. You then do that same cycle 2 other times in 2 other locations for this game until you die or beat the 3rd and final boss. That general game structure could probably apply to 100 other games, so let's get into some of the nuances of Mana Spark. First off, there are 3 characters that you'll eventually unlock. Now, if I'm completely honest, I've only unlocked the first 2 so far, but I'll still talk about the 3rd character a little bit. Your starting fighter is called the Hunter. You're equipped with a powerful bow and have a roll that is up every couple of seconds. The second fighter you get after defeating the first boss is called the Guard. The Guard uses a crossbow which deals less damage, but has a higher attack speed than the Hunter's bow. The Guard also has 3 dashes which slowly recharge, as opposed to the roll of the Hunter. The last fighter you unlock, presumably after you defeat the second boss, is the Warrior. The Warrior has a sword and shield, which makes him or her the only melee character in the game. Also, instead of having a dash or a roll, they're able to block enemy attacks with their shield. You might already be a bit suspicious given that there are only 3 characters to play, but I think the main element we need to focus on is whether or not these characters feel unique in style. Although I haven't unlocked the Warrior yet, I think it's a pretty safe assumption that the melee character feels much different to play than the 2 ranged characters. So then, do the Hunter and Guard feel different enough from each other? It was an odd design choice having the first 2 characters being similar bow type classes, but thankfully the Hunter and Guard did feel much different. When you play the Hunter, your attacks feel very deliberate, almost like a sniper. You shoot powerful shots, and because you have to draw your bow for each arrow, you don't shoot very quickly. Also, having the roll as opposed to the 3 dashes makes your mobility feel very different than the Guard as well. When you play the Guard, you're able to shoot at a much higher clip, but since your shots deal less damage, you often have to sink at least 2 bolts to get a kill. This actually leads well into discussing what your foes are like. The enemies are actually one specific element that the game prides itself on in most of the marketing I've found. In most descriptions of the game, it talks about how the enemy AI is programmed in such a way that they work together to fight you. What's funny to me is that I've been playing a bit of Yakuza 0 recently, and in many of those fights with multiple people, only one enemy strikes you at a time. That results in fights that are pretty much one-on-one despite you being up against two or more people. In contrast, Mana Spark enemies don't take turns. If they have a line of sight on you, they will all continue to attack until either you or they die. Even ignoring how the AI is, the enemies in this game are very well designed. Each enemy has its own distinct patterns and weaknesses, which makes fighting them almost entirely skill-based. For example, there's a crossbow enemy with a shield who's vulnerable when he's reloading or when you're behind him. You need to be extremely careful though because he has a very strong and fast bolt attack and will charge you with his shield if you get too close. There's also a flower enemy that's invulnerable when it's closed, but when it opens up, it produces a bunch of little dudes that explode when they're hit. Each enemy has its own distinctions, which really helped keep the combat interesting. The unique enemy design also carried over to bosses, but what's disappointing is that there are only 3 bosses to face in all of Mana Spark. Many other roguelike games choose to have a rotating cast of bosses, so like when you get to the first level boss, you'll get one of 3 different bosses each run. But in this game, I faced the same bosses every single run of this game. This leads to a similar complaint as with having only 3 classes to play. More on that later though. The last element of the game I want to touch on is permanent progression outside of runs and temporary progression within runs. Outside of runs, your progression takes the form of you recruiting more people to your village and upgrading aspects which each improve your dungeon crawls in a different way. For example, if you go to the cook, you can use your mana runes to purchase better meals that give you buffs before you take on the dungeons. Some meals buff damage or give you higher health before you enter. Another person you can talk with in town allows you to switch out your starting ability. This is something I didn't talk about yet because the abilities are the same no matter what character you're playing. You're allowed to take one ability or trap into the game that's on a short cooldown. You'll start out either with a net that slows enemies down or a bear trap that does damage to the first enemy that steps on it. However, as you progress through the game, you're able to use your mana runes to unlock better and better starting abilities, including a turret that deals damage when you deploy it, and a Deadeye ability which allows you to slow down time and fire 2 shots in rapid succession. One other person in town who you can talk to, who I found to be very unique to this sort of game, allows you to research enemies. For example, if the boar enemy is a real pain in your ass, you can research it and then weaken it for your upcoming runs. Whenever you face a boar after that, it will be much easier to take down. You're only allowed to weaken one enemy at a time, but I loved this mechanic because it helped reduce some in-run frustration. It was almost like a mechanic of targeted difficulty, and honestly, I would be very okay with it if more games had some sort of mechanic just like this. When it comes to in-run progression, I was pleased overall. As you work your way through the dungeons, enemies drop coins and mana runes. The coins are your temporary in-run currency, and the runes are your permanent out-of-run currency for those upgrades we just talked about. Every so often in a room, you might find a chest with an upgrade in it. These upgrades range from pretty standard buffs like higher attack and attack speed, to cool effects like penetrating or poisonous shots and bouncing arrows. Not only can you get those abilities randomly from chests, but you can get them from a place called the Peculiar Room. The Peculiar Room accomplishes 2 things for the game. It first of all deposits your mana runes in a box so that you don't lose them when you die. It also gives you the option to purchase more abilities for your character with those coins you've been collecting through the run. Although there weren't a ton of upgrades all in all, there were quite a few very fun ones to use, and certain combinations that were quite OP. For example, it's pretty strong to get the double arrow shot in conjunction with the arrows that poison and slow your enemies. You're pretty much able to kite out all of your foes indefinitely. Poison is also quite strong against the bosses since they each have periods where they're unable to be attacked. Poisoning them allows ticks of damage even when they're unable to take additional hits. To round out our discussion of gameplay, there are some pretty clear negatives, but all in all, the combat was enjoyable, especially once you learn how to deal with the enemies and get a few upgrades under your belt. The combat was hard, but it never felt unfair due to the solid enemy design. Now that we've talked about the narrative and gameplay, let's discuss the art and sound design. On the artistic side, I actually was a really big fan of the pixel art. It didn't have vibrant colors or amazing animations like last week in Iconoclasts, but there was something soothing about how it looked. Especially in the first zone, the colors were beautiful muted greens and purples. The art was simple but effective. Some of the indoor dungeon areas weren't quite as pretty as the outside, but there still was something appealing to the way it looked. That simplicity and muted nature also paired well with the quiet music. The soundtrack was, for the most part, just quiet music that gave the feel of a fantasy world. What's really interesting though is that music can often have such a hidden impact on the way we feel while we're playing games. For example, in The Messenger, the soundtrack is fast-paced and high intensity, which pushed me to play at a much higher pace. Horror games are often so damn scary because of the creepy quiet soundtracks that make you think something is around the next corner. In a similar way, although the actual music in Manaspark didn't stand out, the way it made the game feel to me did. It was peaceful, which went hand in hand with the muted colors and dampened pixel art, and which in turn gave me a more quiet mindset. Why I think that's so important is because roguelikes are inherently frustrating games, especially if you're not a very skilled gamer. The whole genre is built around grinding out a ton of deaths before you even have a chance to truly progress. Some roguelikes soften this frustration by giving you a lot of cool loot or items to find, like in the case of Dead Cells. Others have a bunch of different classes to try, like in the case of Soul Knight. As we already talked about, Manaspark has a very limited roster of characters, and although there are some cool items, there's a pretty limited pool of those as well. That's where I think the music and art help to shore up the frustration of grinding out progression. Sure, my first few runs were frustrating, but once I got into a rhythm of playing, I started to understand the flow better and I sank into the feel of the world. When I died, it sucked, but instead of feeling like I was jumping off a high dive into a pool of concrete, it felt like there was some nice, refreshing water there to catch me each time. The more I relaxed and took this game less seriously, the more I could just chill out and enjoy it for the fun aspects it had to offer. Now that we've made it through the narrative, gameplay, art, and sound design, let's summarize with some positives and negatives. On the positive side, first off, each enemy felt unique to fight against, and the characters you can play also felt different enough in terms of style. The abilities were also fun to play and experiment with. Second, I love the ability to weaken specific enemies by researching them. It felt like a very unique mechanic that helps shore up some of my weaknesses as a player without dumbing down the entire game. Third, the art and sound design set a wonderful tone for this game. When I was visiting family the other weekend, I found this to be a wonderful game to play while I was hanging out in the living room. It was satisfying and peaceful without being too much of a distraction. On the negative side, the first thing I have to mention is the Switch controls. Although this is most likely not an issue on PC, the way this game controlled did not feel right on Switch. Second, the narrative was honestly pitiful. This genre of games typically is much more mechanically focused, but I would have loved at least a little bit more context for why and who my characters were fighting. Third, and most important, the replayability of this game is incredibly lacking. There are 3 characters and 3 bosses. Sure, I've played over 5 hours and still haven't made it to the 3rd boss, but that still doesn't excuse the fact that there isn't any variety in bosses at each level, and my choice of characters is incredibly limited. Although procedural generations of levels does provide some variety from run to run, in the end, a dungeon is a dungeon, and whether there are 2 archers and 1 skeleton on a 30 by 20 map, or 2 skeletons and 1 archer on a 20 by 30 map, it's not going to feel all that much different. To give you a little bit of context, I have a free game on my phone called Soul Knight that's a dungeon crawly roguelike that has at least 6 unique characters to play, a ton of weapons, and at least 2 unique bosses for each level. There are plenty of things in that game which are worse than Mana Spark, but the point is that when you're in such a saturated space of good roguelikes, you really have to go above and beyond in order to stand out and be worth it. We've made it now to the final boss. This is the part of the podcast where I let you know whether you should slay the game and buy it, flee the game and avoid it, or farm up and wait for a sale. Unfortunately, my verdict for Mana Spark is to flee this game. When I first started playing, I almost switched to another game entirely because I disliked it so much. But I actually got into a rhythm at a certain point and did want to play more. Despite that being the case, I can't with good conscience recommend this game unless you're a die-hard roguelike fan who has to play every title in that genre. Mana Spark has some solid core gameplay, but when there are other games that just do a similar formula much better, such as Dead Cells, it makes this game feel like such a waste of time. As always, thank you so much for taking the time to listen in. Despite Mana Spark being a game to flee, I still had a lot of fun recording, and I hope you had a good time as well. If you really enjoy the show and have become a regular listener, I want to encourage you to head on over to iTunes to give the show a 5-star review. Even if you don't listen on that platform, getting positive reviews there really helps with the show being seen. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you in-game.